The year is 1957. The world is a monochromatic study in post-war conformity. Yet on silver screens across America, a vibrant, terrifying, and wildly imaginative future is being projected in glorious Technicolor. This was a decade of the flying saucer, the giant mutated insect, and the hero Rocket Man. The golden age of science fiction cinema. Dismissed by critics at the time as B-movie schlock, these films were, in fact, remarkably prescient mirrors of a future none of their creators could have truly comprehended. Today, standing squarely in the 21st century, we are living inside the dreams and often the nightmares that flickered across those vintage screens. This is a journey back to the atomic age, to discover how the anxieties, fears, and boundless ambitions of the 1950s gave birth to imaginative visions that align, with often shocking accuracy, with our present-day realities. We invite you to look closely at the grainy frames of films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, and The War of the Worlds, not as dusty relics of a bygone era, but as prophetic blueprints of modern technology, social anxieties, and geopolitical realities. The central question is not whether they got every detail right. The jetpacks and dome cities are still works in progress, but whether they captured the essence of our future. Did they predict the psychological toll of mass surveillance, the ethical minefield of genetic engineering, or the transformative power of the microchip? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. The science fiction of the 1950s was less about forecasting specific inventions and more about exploring the consequences of technology unleashed. The decade's relentless focus on the possibility of hostile alien takeover was a thinly veiled metaphor for the fear of Soviet infiltration. The terror of mutated insects reflected deep, profound anxieties about the unseen effects of nuclear power, and the dream of interplanetary travel was the emotional engine of the looming space race. What began as low-budget escapism was, in reality, a collective act of foresight, a cultural processing of unprecedented technological and military change. As we delve into these vintage predictions, we will unearth the surprising accuracy of the era's vision of robotics, communication technology, and even urban planning. We will analyze the cinematic fears of thought control and genetic manipulation, and measure them against the ethical dilemmas posed by our current advancements in artificial intelligence and bioengineering. The visions of the 1950s were projections born from both hope for a technologically advanced world and dread of a nuclear one. The era was defined by the paradox of limitless possibility and imminent destruction, and its cinema captured that tension perfectly. We will trace the line from colossal, reel-to-reel computers of the films to the sleek, personalized devices in our pockets, from the lumbering, metallic robot to screen to the sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that now govern our lives. The journey starts not in the future, but in a small, tense decade where the artists and writers, often working on shoestring budgets, manage to look past the immediate anxieties of their time and see the shape of things to come, giving us a filmography that has now become a historical document of startling predictive power. Their visions are no longer fiction. They are our everyday life. The decade of the 1950s was a period perpetually overshadowed by the specter of global annihilation. The successful detonation of atomic bombs by the United States and the Soviet Union in quick succession created an atmosphere of pervasive, low-level dread. The very air seemed to hum with the possibility of immediate nuclear war, and this terrifying geopolitical reality, the mushroom cloud, became the single greatest catalyst for the explosion of science fiction creativity during the era. Every monster, every alien invasion, and every dystopian landscape projected onto screen was a direct, often thinly veiled, cinematic processing of the Cold War's anxieties. The science fiction genre became the only acceptable cultural space where the true, unimaginable terror of the atomic age could be openly confronted. Films of the period channeled public fear into tangible threats. The relentless, alien invaders in classics like The War of the Worlds and Invasion of the Body Snatchers were not just extraterrestrials. They were direct metaphors for fear of communist infiltration and the erosion of American individuality. In The War of the Worlds, the invaders are cold, logical, and unstoppable, reflecting the perceived ideological ruthlessness of the Soviet system. Similarly, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, with its pod people who look and act exactly like their victims but lack any human emotion or spirit, perfectly capture the era's paranoia about domestic spies, ideological conformity, and a loss of self in a collectivist society. This fear of losing individuality to an external, unseen enemy was perhaps the most enduring psychological prediction of the 1950s cinema. The monster movies, a staple of the decade, directly utilized the fear of atomic mutation. Following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and continued nuclear testing, the public was bombarded with information about the mysterious and devastating effects of radiation. This fear manifested on screen in gigantic, mutated beasts. Them featured enormous, irradiated ants, while the beast from 20,000 Fathoms showcased a colossal dinosaur awakened by an atomic test. These monsters served as an elegant cinematic equation. Nuclear power plus ignorance equals uncontrollable destruction. They were the physical manifestation of scientific overreach and the ethical cost of playing with forces man could not fully understand or contain. This preoccupation with mutation foreshadowed the deep ethical debates we now face concerning genetic modification and bioengineering. The film industry became the nation's subconscious therapist, allowing the public to face their deepest fears in the controlled environment of a movie theater. The creativity born from this tension gave rise to some of the most enduring themes in sci-fi. The concept of the reluctant hero thrust into global conflict, the idea of science as both the savior and the destroyer, and the necessity of global cooperation against an existential threat. The Cold War anxiety, therefore, did not merely influence 1950 science fiction. It created it, turning a decade of fear into a vast canvas for creative expression that ultimately helped define the look, feel, and philosophical depth of modern science fiction, providing a grim but strangely accurate preview of the surveillance state and the permanent state of global tension that would define the decades to follow. The shadow of the mushroom cloud was long, and we are still walking in it. In the futuristic landscapes of 1950 science fiction, one figure stands out as an emblem of foresight and fantasy: the autonomous robot. Films of this era, most notably the seminal classic Forbidden Planet 1956, did more than just sketch out metallic men. They predicted the integration of automated servitude and complex artificial intelligence into human life, an imaginative leap that remarkably aligns with our modern-day reliance on personal robotics and sophisticated AI systems. The concept of the robot, an artificial being designed to serve humanity, had existed in literature for decades, but the 1950s cinema solidified its image and defined its relationship with its human masters. Robbie the robot, the iconic mechanical servant from Forbidden Planet, is the perfect case study. Robbie was not a clanking, purely mechanical automaton. He was a machine capable of complex reasoning, instant linguistic translation, and even rudimentary emotional expression, all features that are central to the development goals of today's advanced AI. His utility was boundless, capable of creating clothing, replicating food, and managing the intricate needs of his isolated human companions. This vision went far beyond simple automated labor. It predicted a future where specialized, intelligent, and even personalized robotics will become commonplace, a prediction we now recognize in our ubiquitous smart home assistants, automated factory lines, and experimental domestic robots. The core predictive accuracy of the 1950s films was not the visual design of the robot, though Robbie's intricate bubble-headed look is instantly recognizable, but the prediction of AI specialization and interface. Robbie could respond in natural human language and perform complex tasks based on verbal commands, a direct parallel to the voice-activated, machine learning interfaces we interact with daily, from asking a device to play music to requesting complex data retrieval. The decade understood that the true revolution in robotics would be less about physical strength and more about sophisticated software and seamless human-machine interaction, anticipating the shift from industrial automation to informational automation. Furthermore, the sci-fi of the 1950s implicitly raised the ethical and societal questions that now dominate our discourse on AI. Films often portrayed the inherent dangers of unchecked artificial intelligence, either through robots becoming too powerful, like the unseen monster from the ID, in Forbidden Planet that was mentally controlled, or through the ethical ambiguity of creating a sentient being. This foresight anticipated the modern debate over AI ethics, control systems, and the potential for technological creation to turn against its creator. The decade's fascination with the automated age was driven by the post-war economic boom and the dream of labor-free existence, coupled with the Cold War's push for technological supremacy. The films provided a safe space to explore both the utopian promise of universal automation and the dystopian fear of technological rebellion. The dream of the personal robot, first sketched out in the B-movies of the 1950s, is now manifest in the sophisticated, intelligent systems that manage our communications, run our homes, and optimize our logistical chains. The image of Robbie, faithfully serving his master, is a vintage precursor to the personalized, adaptive AI assistants that are now embedded into the very fabric of our modern, automated lives. The decade of the 1950s was characterized by an obsession with the sky, an obsession fueled equally by the fear of nuclear delivery systems and the boundless ambition of the nascent space race. While films were filled with flying saucers and terrifying alien encounters, this pervasive cinematic fixation on outer space was, in fact, a powerful cultural incubator that directly foreshadowed and perhaps even propelled the real-world development of satellite technology, global communication networks, and the eventual colonization of space. The constant visibility of alien craft on screen conditioned the public to accept the extraordinary idea of objects routinely orbiting and traversing the Earth's atmosphere, making the subsequent reality of artificial satellites less shocking and more readily embraced. Films like Earth versus the Flying Saucers and It Came from Outer Space captured the public imagination with the possibility of space travel and the existence of extraterrestrial life. Crucially, these films often depicted advanced civilizations utilizing sophisticated global communication and positioning technologies far beyond the simple radio transmissions of the time. The very concept of aliens traversing the vastness of space required a massive leap in thinking about propulsion, navigation, and, most importantly, orbital mechanics, concepts that were then central to the top-secret planning within government and military agencies. The cinematic fantasy of the flying saucer was a cultural proxy for the real-world race to deploy satellite networks. Just as the aliens needed to communicate across vast distances, the military and telecommunications industries needed to launch objects into orbit for reconnaissance and communication relay. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the public was already psychologically prepared for the idea of an object circling the globe, thanks in no small part to a decade of science fiction film conditioning. The fictional, menacing presence of alien ships became a perverse blueprint for the real, politically charged presence of orbiting satellites. Furthermore, the 1950s cinema was rife with visions of manned space missions. While films like Rocket Ship XM 1950 or Destination Moon 1950 often contain technical inaccuracies, their commitment to depicting the process of rocket launch, trajectory calculation, and the physiological effects of zero gravity was groundbreaking. They popularized concepts like multi-stage rockets, spacesuits, and orbital habitats, helping to build the public support necessary for the massive funding of the Mercury and Apollo programs that would follow in the 1960s. The cinematic hero who journeyed to Mars or the Moon was a powerful prototype for the real-life astronauts who would soon become national idols. The fascination with the skies in the 1950s was a critical cultural bridge. It transformed the unimaginable, placing objects of humans outside the Earth's atmosphere, into a widely accepted possibility, laying the cultural groundwork for the space age. The flying saucer, initially a symbol of invasion, ultimately became a cinematic herald for the very satellite networks that now facilitate our global communication, weather tracking, and national security, proving that even the most fantastic cinematic visions can contain a core of technical prophecy. The home environment of the 1950s was dominated by the bulky, box-like cathode ray tube CRT television set, a piece of furniture more than a device. Yet, within the science fiction films of that decade, a completely different future for visual media and communication was being relentlessly predicted: the age of the flat, interactive, and portable display. The imaginative leap from the wooden console television to the sleek, high-resolution screens that now saturate our lives is one of the most remarkable and pervasive prophecies of 1950s cinema, essentially predicting the existence of modern monitors, tablets, and video conferencing technology decades before the invention of the microchip. In films depicting advanced utopian societies or futuristic command centers, the CRT was conspicuously absent. Instead, characters interacted with large, wall-mounted displays that were impossibly thin and capable of projecting vibrant, complex information. These wall screens, or the futuristic communication panels seen in films like This Island Earth, 1955, were direct precursors to our modern flat-screen televisions, high-definition monitors, and interactive whiteboards. The films understood that the limiting factor of the past would be overcome, and that screens would eventually blend seamlessly into the architecture of the home and office, moving from bulky accessories to ubiquitous surfaces. Beyond simple display technology, the 1950s Sci-Fi was a prophetic herald of video communication. The need for remote communication with distant space colonies or global command centers frequently led to scenes depicting characters engaging in video calls. Two-way, real-time visual conversations. This was an astonishing prediction in an era where long-distance communication was limited to static phone calls and telegrams. The concept of seeing the person you were talking to integrated into a visual communication device is the bedrock of modern platforms like Zoom, FaceTime, and countless others. The films correctly foresaw that as technology advanced, humanity would inherently seek a more visually rich and immersive form of remote interaction, transforming communication from a purely auditory experience to a multimedia one. Furthermore, these films hinted at the concept of portable, informational displays. While they didn't predict the smartphone explicitly, the idea of characters carrying small, wrist-mounted devices or handheld panels to access data and communicate, often seen in the hands of astronauts or future law enforcement, laid the conceptual groundwork for the tablet and the smartwatch. The cinema of the time understood that information would eventually need to escape the confines of the desk and become a fluid, personal resource accessible anywhere. The 1950s vision was not limited by the technology of its day. It was driven by the inherent desire for faster, clearer, and more visual communication. The cinematic portrayal of these advanced displays subtly influenced the technological aspirations of a generation of scientists and engineers, turning a fantasy projection into a practical goal. Today, our reliance on thin, glowing screens for work, entertainment, and social life is a full realization of the small screen prophet of 1950s cinema, a prophecy that has utterly transformed the way we perceive, share, and consume information in the modern world. No film from the 1950s provides a more chilling and resonant metaphor for modern anxiety than Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. On the surface, the film is a horror story about extraterrestrial seed pods replacing human beings with emotionless duplicates, the infamous pod people. Historically, the film was widely interpreted as a direct allegory for the Cold War fear of communist conformity, the idea that neighbors and friends could secretly be ideological clones, stripped of their American individuality. Today, however, the film's terrifying vision of the wholesale replacement of self by a silent, unseen process has taken on a profoundly modern digital resonance, serving as a dark mirror to the anxiety of digital conformity and the loss of self to algorithms. The most terrifying aspect of the pod people is their lack of unique human emotion, creativity, and spiritual depth. They are functionally identical to the originals, but exist only to propagate the collective, a horrifying vision of a world where individual thought is suppressed for the smooth functioning of the whole. This vision aligns perfectly with the modern psychological anxiety surrounding social media algorithms and digital echo chambers. The algorithms that govern online life often reward conformity, pushing users toward content and opinions that reinforce the collective rather than challenge it. The fear is that, through subtle digital influence, our unique perspectives, tastes, and even political opinions are being subtly snatched and replaced by algorithmically optimized, emotionally flattened versions of ourselves, digital pod people who exist to maximize engagement for platform. Furthermore, the film's theme of unseen, silent replacement mirrors the modern fear of deepfakes and digital identity theft. The pod people look exactly like their victims, making identification impossible until the victim reveals a flicker of genuine human emotion. This foreshadowed our current struggle with distinguishing between authentic human interaction and synthetic, AI-generated content. When sophisticated deepfakes can perfectly clone a person's face and voice, the anxiety of the 1950s, "Is that really my neighbor?" is replaced by the anxiety of the 2020s. "Is that really my friend on the other end of this video call?" The constant need to verify digital authenticity is a full realization of the film's narrative premise. The 1950s, through this film, captured the deeply human fear of dehumanization through homogenization. The paranoia wasn't just about politics. It was about the intrinsic value of the unique human spirit. The body snatcher's ultimate goal was to create a society of smooth, emotionless efficiency, a goal that many critics today see reflected in the drive toward mass automation and the optimization of human behavior for commercial or political ends. Invasion of the Body Snatchers thus stands as a timeless warning. What was once interpreted as fear of the Red Scare is now a chillingly accurate metaphor for the cultural cost of technological ubiquity, forcing us to constantly question the authenticity of our reality and the integrity of our individual selves in the digital age. The post-war boom of the 1950s saw explosive growth in both suburban sprawl and urban density, creating a dual anxiety about where humanity was heading. While many Americans were moving to detached homes, the decade science fiction cinema often projected a future defined by impossibly vertical cities, sprawling megastructures that stacked humanity upon itself, a vision that surprisingly predicted the rapid, high-density development and the accompanying logistical challenges of our modern global metropolises. Films of the era, heavily influenced by earlier German expressionist works like Metropolis, took the concept of the skyscraper to its logical extreme, showcasing structures that reach the clouds, entire self-contained civilizations built on top of one another. These vertical utopias/dystopias, seen implicitly in films like The Colossus of New York or through set design in many futuristic narratives, were not merely architectural fantasies. They were a cinematic processing of the inherent tension between technological advancement and human overcrowding. The prediction was not just about height, but about density and isolation. These fictional cities often suffer from social stratification, with the elite living in the airy, sunlit upper tiers, while the working class toiled in the perpetually shadowed lower levels. This vision chillingly mirrors the economic and social stratification seen in real-world hyperdense cities today, where access to light space and clean air often dictates one's social and financial status. The films recognize that extreme density would exacerbate existing social inequalities, a phenomenon now evident in global hubs where housing crises and income disparities are amplified by intense vertical living. Furthermore, the 1950s sci-fi correctly foresaw the logistical complexities of such dense environments. Characters were often seen navigating complex networks of automated vertical transit, multi-layered roads, and enclosed pedestrian walkways that separated human movement from the chaos of ground-level traffic. This vision perfectly anticipates the development of modern urban planning solutions: high-speed vertical elevators, intricate subway systems built directly beneath skyscrapers, and a continued push for elevated or underground rapid transit to manage impossible levels of human flow. The films understood that traditional street-level infrastructure would fail under the pressure of the predicted population density. The vertical city was also a symbol of isolation within proximity. Characters in these cinematic high-rises often lived solitary, disconnected lives, rarely interacting with their neighbors despite being separated by only a thin wall. This predicted the modern phenomenon of urban loneliness, the paradox of being constantly surrounded by millions of people yet feeling profoundly disconnected. The anxiety was that technology and density would solve spatial problems only to create emotional ones. The 1950s cinematic vision of the vertical city, born from both architectural ambition and demographic fear, serves as a powerful testament to predictive power of sci-fi. It was a forecast not just of steel and glass, but the social, economic, and logistical challenges that would define 21st century urban life. proving that the filmmakers were concerned with the human cost of unprecedented growth. The atomic age did not only give us the fear of communism, it gave us the fear of the uncontrollable forces unleashed by science itself. The quintessential monster movies of the 1950s, such as them, 1954, and the original Japanese Gojira in 1954, showcased gigantic, mutated creatures, ants, dinosaurs, or other beasts that were the direct products of nuclear radiation. While these films were thrilling B-movie spectacles, their underlying narrative was profound, ethical warning that remarkably foreshadowed the deep moral and scientific anxieties we now grapple with concerning genetic engineering, biotech, and man's ability to manipulate life itself. The fear projected onto the screen was not merely of a large beast, but of a breakdown in biological order. In them, giant ants appear as a result of atomic testing in the New Mexico desert. The core terror is that the carefully regulated rules of nature have been broken, resulting in a creature that is hyper-aggressive, impossible to contain, and capable of existential threat. This cinematic terror is a direct precursor to the ethical dilemma posed by modern genetic tools like CRISPR, where the ability to edit the fundamental building blocks of life, DNA, offers immense potential but also carries a risk of unforeseen, catastrophic consequences. The accidental creation of a new, dangerous organism or the irreversible corruption of the human genome. The monster was a physical embodiment of the phrase, "Just because we can doesn't mean we should." The films tapped into a deep, universal human anxiety about scientific overreach and lack of accountability. The scientists in these movies were often portrayed as arrogant, naive, or simply overwhelmed by the forces they unleashed. This reflects the public's emerging distrust of scientific institutions that were operating under military secrecy and without apparent ethical oversight. Today, this anxiety manifests in public concern over genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and the potential for designer babies, where technology outpaces public discourse and regulatory frameworks. The giant monster was a perfect vehicle for this fear, because its size and power represented the scale of the scientific transgression. The creature was too big to fight and too terrible to ignore, symbolizing a scientific error that was too vast to be easily corrected. Furthermore, the cinematic focus on evolutionary acceleration, creatures rapidly evolving or mutating, is a fascinating pre-echo of the speed of modern biological advancement. The 1950s film suggested that scientific tampering could fast-track natural selection, a concept highly relevant to the speed at which modern labs can manipulate and reproduce genetic code. The fear of the giant was thus a primal, visceral processing of the dawning reality that humanity had acquired the power to fundamentally alter the biological world. While the special effects of the time may now seem quaint, the ethical foresight embedded in the narratives remains chillingly accurate, proving that the monster movies of the 1950s were, beneath the spectacle, serious ethical parables about the genetic future that we are now actively creating. The anxieties of the Cold War and the accompanying technological race of the 1950s led science fiction cinema to a grim prediction that has become a chilling reality: the age of mass surveillance and the profound loss of personal secrecy. The films of this era, characterized by their obsession with hidden enemies and total information control, envisioned society where privacy was a relic of the past, a terrifying concept that perfectly aligns with the pervasive networks of digital and physical monitoring that define the 21st century. The fictional command centers in future societies in 1950s sci-fi were often a glass house, an environment where every action was monitored and every piece of information was centrally controlled. Though they did not use the term CCTV or data mining, these films predicted the functional reality of these technologies. In many scenarios involving futuristic law enforcement or authoritarian regimes, characters were tracked by unseen eyes, their movements noted, and their conversations intercepted. This cinematic vision was an early cultural processing of the technology available to the state, such as advanced radar, early computing power, and the military's burgeoning intelligence capabilities. The most profound prediction was the concept of total transparency as a means of control. The alien invaders or futuristic governments often sought to eliminate dissent by eliminating secrecy, using omnipresent monitoring to enforce ideological or social compliance. This foreshadows a contemporary fear of the surveillance state, with a vast network of street cameras, facial recognition software, and digital footprints creates a constant, unblinking eye that tracks citizens' movements and associations. The 1950s films understood that the technology of information gathering would inevitably turn inward, focusing the state's immense power onto its own populace. Furthermore, the cinema of the time explored the psychological toll of living in a state of constant observation. Characters were often depicted as paranoid, whispering in secret, or desperately seeking out hidden spaces to communicate freely. This narrative element captures the modern phenomenon of self-censorship and the chilling effect that constant digital surveillance has on public discourse and personal expression. The fear was not just being seen, but of the consequences of being seen expressing an undesirable thought, a fear highly relevant to today's political and corporate environment. The films recognized that the end of secrecy would fundamentally alter human behavior. The era's focus on surveillance was driven by the fear of infiltration, leading to a cinematic projection where the only way to ensure national security was to eliminate individual privacy entirely. The Glass House, therefore, is the 1950s most enduring cautionary tale. What began as a hyperbolic cinematic plot device has become the invisible architectural reality of our modern, digitally interconnected world, proving that the filmmakers were keenly aware of the inevitable power dynamics inherent in the technology of sight and information control. Amidst the fears of giant monsters and communist infiltration, the 1950s science fiction cinema held on to a tenacious, optimistic vision of humanity's destiny among the stars. The genre's meticulous focus on rocket men and Mars missions was not merely escapism. It was a deeply influential, often technically accurate, foreshadowing the real-world methodologies, technologies, and even the physical experience of space travel that would define the NASA programs of the following decades. These films served as a critical cultural bridge, preparing the public for the immense financial and intellectual commitment required to conquer the final frontier. Early films like Destination Moon 1950 and Rocket Ship XM 1950 were groundbreaking for their dedication to technical realism, a departure from earlier, more fantastical space operas. They consulted with real rocket scientists and engineers, understanding that the core appeal of the new wave of sci-fi was its plausibility. These films accurately depicted concepts that were then on the drawing board but not yet realized, including multi-stage rockets. The films correctly showed that to escape Earth's gravity, a rocket would need to shed mass in successive stages, a principle that is fundamental to every major space launch vehicle, from the Saturn V to the modern Falcon Heavy. Zero-gravity effects. Early sci-fi attempted to portray the experience of weightlessness, often showing astronauts floating within the cabin. While the effects were primitive, the film successfully introduced the public to the physical reality of microgravity, a concept essential to the training and public image of early astronauts. Orbital mechanics and trajectory. The narratives frequently hinge on the complex mathematics of reaching a target like the Moon or Mars, discussing concepts like escape velocity and orbital paths. This elevated the public understanding of the science involved, making the upcoming space race feel like a thrilling, achievable goal rather than pure fantasy. The rocket men themselves, the cinematic astronauts, were portrayed not as swashbuckling heroes, but as engineers, scientists, and military pilots, reflecting the actual backgrounds of the men who would later become the Mercury 7 astronauts. This focus on the scientific and technical prowess required for space travel elevated the genre and gave legitimacy to the real-world space programs that were then being developed in secret. The costumes worn by the actors, particularly the sleek, helmeted spacesuits, established a visual iconography that heavily influenced the design and aesthetic of the real-life pressure suits developed by NASA. The films understood the practical necessity of full-body environmental protection, a core engineering challenge of manned spaceflight. The optimistic, technically grounded vision of the 1950s sci-fi did more than entertain. It became a national roadmap for aspiration. It showed what was possible, creating a public appetite and a cultural understanding that was absolutely essential for securing the political will and the trillions of dollars needed to send humans to the moon. The cinematic voyage to Mars was the ultimate rehearsal for the real-life space race, making the decade's focus on rocketry one of its most potent and accurately realized technical prophecies. The technological reality of the 1950s was defined by sheer physical bulk. Computers occupied entire rooms, vacuum tubes powered electronics, and communication devices were heavy, stationary fixtures. Yet, the science fiction cinema of the era, driven by the needs of espionage, future militaries, and space travel, repeatedly made an astonishingly accurate prediction: the inevitability of miniaturization. The imaginative leap from colossal mainframes to sleek, handheld devices is one of the most commercially and culturally profound prophecies of the decade, effectively foreshadowing the birth of the microchip and, ultimately, the smartphone. In the world of 1950s sci-fi, portability was a mark of advanced technology. Characters, particularly spies, astronauts, or advanced aliens, were often equipped with wrist communicators or small, compact devices that allowed instant two-way visual or audio communication from vast distances. These devices, which seemed magical at the time, were the conceptual ancestors of the modern smartphone and the smartwatch. The films understood that true technological freedom would only be achieved when devices ceased to anchor users to a specific location. This vision correctly identified the shift from large, central processing centers to decentralized, personalized technology. The core idea predicted was ubiquitous access. The films anticipated a world where data and communication would be available at the user's fingertips anytime, anywhere. This contrasted sharply with the reality of 1950s life, where accessing information often meant visiting a library or waiting for a news broadcast. The on-screen necessity of instant, personal communication drove the imaginative design of these compact devices, accurately predicting the high-speed, personalized information access that defines our current era. Furthermore, the decade's films often utilized miniaturized surveillance and recording devices, tiny cameras, hidden microphones, or portable sensors, necessary for plot advancement in spy thrillers. These elements directly foreshadowed the rapid development of solid-state electronics and microelectromechanical systems, MEMS, that made devices like tiny digital cameras, miniature microphones, and complex sensors commonplace in the 21st century. The fictional need for concealment and portability pushed the imaginative limits, proving that the filmmakers were instinctively grasping the direction of electronic engineering: smaller, faster, and more discreet. The filmmakers of the 1950s did not invent the transistor, but their narratives created the cultural demand for what the transistor would eventually enable. The continuous presence of highly advanced, impossibly small devices on screen conditioned the public to expect and desire such technology, influencing the trajectory of consumer electronics innovation. The shrinking world of 1950s sci-fi was thus a powerful, collective act of technical aspiration. The vision of the astronaut communicating via a wrist device or the secret agent utilizing a concealed camera is no longer a fantasy. It is our reality, proving that the cinema of the atomic age correctly mapped the conceptual path from massive machinery to the sleek, indispensable power of the handheld device. The power over nature was a recurring, often terrifying theme in 1950 science fiction, reflecting the post-atomic hubris that humanity could not only split the atom, but also command the very forces of the planet. Films explored the idea of weaponizing the weather, controlling storms, creating floods, or inducing drought, a cinematic obsession that served as a strange, bifurcated prophecy. On one hand, the films got the mechanism wrong, focusing on direct military control, but on the other, they got the outcome chillingly right, inadvertently predicting the scale of global ecological crises and the catastrophic effects of human actions on the planet's climate. The 1950s sci-fi often portrayed weather control as the ultimate strategic weapon, a capability that allowed the Cold War adversaries or hostile aliens to launch devastating, targeted attacks without using conventional explosives. This vision was driven by the desire for ultimate power, the ability to turn nature against the enemy. However, in contemporary reality, the true control over the weather has emerged not through targeted military technology, but through inadvertent, slow-motion catastrophe. climate change. The films, while focused on intentional weaponized climate chaos, unknowingly predicted the scale of environmental destruction we now face. Massive superstorms, catastrophic droughts, and radical shifts in global temperature. The fear of climate breakdown was accurately captured, even if the cause was misidentified. Furthermore, the concept of weather manipulation often led to secondary environmental disasters in the films, showing the unpredictable, compounding effects of tampering with natural systems. A localized attempt to control a storm might result in a global tidal wave or an irreversible atmospheric change. This narrative arc mirrors the modern scientific understanding that climate change is a complex, feedback loop system where seemingly small human actions can trigger devastating global consequences that are impossible to stop once initiated. The films understood the inherent danger of scale and the fragility of the global ecosystem. The cinematic exploration of weather warfare also fed into the public's anxiety about resource depletion and ecological fragility. The destruction wrought by controlled storms or targeted droughts often led to widespread famine and societal collapse in the films. This foreshadowed the very real contemporary geopolitical tensions over water scarcity, arable land, and resource access, which are now being exacerbated by climate change. The films implicitly warned that the ultimate conflict would not be between man, but between man and nature, once the ecological balance was irreparably broken. The fascination with weaponizing the weather was a distorted but powerful cultural acknowledgement that humanity had acquired the technological capacity to fundamentally destroy the global environment. While the immediate threat on screen was an alien device or a rogue nation, the true, enduring message was a profound vulnerability of our planet to the actions of its dominant species. Thus, the 1950s films, in their dramatic focus on climate conflict, delivered a crucial, albeit accidental, prophecy about the ecological and geopolitical crises that would define the 21st century's struggle against climate change. The aftermath of World War II left an enduring visual and psychological impact. The reality of human physical limitation and injury. The 1950s science fiction cinema, fueled by the era's boundless faith in engineering, began a pervasive exploration of the bionic body, the concept of enhancing, replacing, or outright improving human physical capabilities through sophisticated machinery. This cinematic vision, featuring everything from rudimentary cybernetic limbs to full-body armored suits, was a direct and accurate precursor to our modern advancements in advanced prosthetics, medical implants, and military exoskeletons, revealing a fundamental belief that the human body was merely the starting point for technological enhancement. Films of the decade, such as The Colossus of New York, 1958, or narratives featuring heroic astronauts utilizing complex mechanical aids, introduced the public to the idea that technology can not only repair but exceed natural human ability. The futuristic prosthetics shown on screen were often more powerful, more precise, and more resilient than the limbs they replaced. This vision aligns perfectly with contemporary research into neuroprosthetics and bionic limbs, where advanced devices are controlled by neurological signals and offer sensory feedback, aiming not just for replacement but for functional superiority. The films, therefore, accurately predicted the goal of modern rehabilitation and bioengineering, to integrate human biology with sophisticated machinery. Furthermore, the concept of the exoskeleton, an external, powered frame worn to augment strength and endurance, was a staple of 1950s military sci-fi and space exploration narratives. These suits allowed a single human to lift massive weights, withstand extreme environments, or move with superhuman speed. This fantasy has now been realized in modern, real-world applications. Military and industrial exoskeletons used to increase a soldier's endurance, assist in heavy lifting, or enable mobility for individuals with spinal injuries. The films correctly identified that the simplest way to enhance human physical capacity was through the application of external power mechanics, anticipating a multi-billion-dollar research field. The visual language of the bionic body also implicitly raised the core ethical question that we grapple with today: the definition of humanity. When does a mechanical replacement stop being a tool and start becoming part of the self? The cinematic bionic man often struggled with his humanity, feeling alienated or corrupted by the cold, logical efficiency of his new parts. This foreshadows a modern debate over human augmentation, the pursuit of transhumanism, and the ethical lines surrounding using technology to fundamentally alter human nature. The 1950s cinematic vision was driven by post-war optimism that science could solve any problem, even physical disability. The bionic body became the symbol of this optimism, predicting a future where the limitations of flesh would be overcome by the power of metal and circuitry. The films were not just showcasing cool gear. They were mapping the trajectory of human evolution through technology, a prophecy now manifest in every sophisticated prosthetic and powered suit of the 21st century. The optimistic visions of automated futures in 1950s science fiction were frequently shadowed by a profound, recurring anxiety, the specter of widespread technological unemployment, and the creation of a massive digital divide. While the films celebrated the automated factory and the personal robot, they often showed the dystopian consequence of this efficiency, predicting the modern social friction between the highly skilled technological elite and a vast, increasingly marginalized class of workers displaced by machines. This socioeconomic forecast is startlingly relevant to our current debates over artificial intelligence, robotics, and the future of labor. Films and narratives featuring fully automated cities or highly specialized scientific outposts often depicted a society where manual labor was either obsolete or performed exclusively by subservient mechanical beings. The resulting social structure was intensely stratified. A small group of highly educated scientists and administrators controlled the technology, while the vast majority of the population was relegated to idleness or meaningless, ritualistic work. This predicted the modern skills gap and the resulting economic polarization, where workers whose jobs could be automated, factory workers, data entry specialists, service industry roles, are increasingly left behind, while those with advanced coding, engineering, or creative skills thrive. The 1950s cinema understood that the benefits of automation would not be distributed equally. The inherent conflict was clearly defined: productivity versus purpose. If machines handled all the necessary labor, what was the meaning and function of the common human worker? This existential crisis, portrayed in various sci-fi narratives as widespread ennui, social unrest, or dependence on state handouts, perfectly mirrors the contemporary discussion surrounding universal basic income (UBI) and the need to redefine human value in a post-labor economy dominated by advanced AI. Furthermore, the films often utilize the fear of obsolescence as a central theme. The human characters who relied on traditional skills, farmers, mechanics, general laborers, were often portrayed as confused, powerless, or hostile toward the new technology, reflecting a legitimate cultural anxiety about the speed of technological change. This accurately foreshadowed the resistance to modern automation and the political movements that emerged from communities feeling left behind by the digital economy. The film's message was clear. While technology would deliver efficiency, it would also fundamentally disrupt the social contract of work and value. The digital divide in 1950s sci-fi was not merely a gap in access to devices. It was a gap in access to purpose and economic stability. By consistently portraying the social and psychological toll of a machine-driven economy, the filmmakers offer a potent, if unintended, critique of technological determinism. The cinema of the atomic age predicted that the greatest challenge of automation would not be engineering machines, but engineering a just and equitable society capable of adapting to them, a challenge that remains central to global political discourse today. The 1950s, a decade preoccupied with the possibility of sudden, violent death by nuclear fire, paradoxically fueled a relentless cinematic fascination with its opposite: immortality and radical life extension. Science fiction films of the era explored the boundaries of human lifespan, often through the concepts of cryogenics, freezing the body for future revival, and advanced biological engineering. This consistent cinematic pursuit of eternal life was a powerful philosophical and scientific prophecy that aligns directly with the ambitious longevity research and the nascent cryonics industry of our present day. Films of the decade frequently featured characters being placed into suspended animation, either for long-distance space travel, a fictional necessity for reaching distant stars, or for escaping an imminent planetary disaster, with the explicit goal of being revived in a more technologically advanced future. This narrative device established the core concept of cryonics, the preservation of life through deep freeze, as a plausible technological goal. While the on-screen technology was pure fantasy, the idea of temporally cheating death by suspending biological processes became a concrete cultural aspiration. The cinematic vision provided the intellectual and emotional groundwork for the actual founding of cryonics organizations in the 1960s and the continued multi-million-dollar research into biological preservation techniques today. The prediction was not about the technique, but the human desire and the will to achieve immortality through technology. Furthermore, 1950s sci-fi explored other avenues for life extension, often involving complex medical procedures, cellular regeneration, or the complete replacement of biological parts with superior, synthetic ones. This foresaw the modern focus on anti-aging research, personalized medicine aimed at reversing cellular degradation, and the search for biological mechanisms of extended health span. The films implicitly suggested that mortality was not a fixed natural law, but a technical challenge that science would eventually overcome. The pursuit of immortality was also often framed as an ethical dilemma. Characters who achieved eternal life in the films were frequently portrayed as isolated, unhappy, or morally corrupt, having paid a terrible price for their unnatural existence. This philosophical exploration foreshadowed the contemporary debates over the ethics of radical life extension, the potential for deepening social inequality, who gets access to technology, the problem of overpopulation, and the existential question of whether an indefinitely extended life retains its human meaning and purpose. The films were acutely aware that technological achievement often comes with profound moral cost. The cinematic quest for life extension was a direct psychological response to the atomic fear of death. If one could be vaporized instantly by a nuclear blast, the counter-desire was to live forever. The 1950s science fiction, through its relentless focus on cryonics and biological enhancement, accurately predicted that the desire to defeat death will become one of humanity's most consuming and technologically demanding endeavors, a prophecy now evidenced by the vast resources being poured into longevity and biotech research across the globe. The cultural landscape of the 1950s was characterized by rigidly defined gender roles, where women were overwhelmingly relegated to domestic spheres while the world of science, technology, and military strategy was almost exclusively male. Yet, within the subversive world of science fiction cinema, a quiet, profound prophecy was being played out: the consistent inclusion of the female scientist. These characters, often central to solving the global crisis or understanding the alien threat, subtly but powerfully challenged the social norms of their time, directly foreshadowing the rise of women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, fields in the 21st century. While their roles were sometimes limited by the cinematic conventions of the day, often needing a male counterpart's validation, the mere presence of intelligent, technically competent women in the lab or the control room was a revolutionary act. In films like The Monolith Monsters or The Day the Earth Stood Still, women were not just bystanders or romantic interests. They were biologists, physicists, and mathematicians whose intellectual contributions were essential to the plot's resolution. They were the ones analyzing the alien DNA, deciphering the cosmic message, or understanding the unique biological vulnerability of the monster. This cinematic choice implicitly promoted the idea that intellect, curiosity, and scientific rigor were not gender-specific qualities, offering an imaginative space where traditional limitations could be temporarily suspended. The female scientists in 1950s sci-fi served as a cultural prototype for the modern woman in STEM. By showing these women working alongside men, often in positions of high pressure and intellectual authority, the film provided early, visible role models that contrasted sharply with the domestic ideals promoted by mainstream media. This subtle, recurring visual message helped normalize the idea of women occupying technical and leadership roles, contributing to the slow, steady erosion of gender barriers in the decades that followed. Furthermore, the inclusion of the female scientist often added a crucial, nuanced perspective to the crisis. While the male military characters might favor brute force or immediate destruction, the female scientists often argue for understanding, communication, and intellectual solution, a contrasting approach that humanized the scientific endeavor. This established a narrative trope where feminine intellect provided the necessary counterbalance to masculine aggression, a subtle critique of the prevailing Cold War focus on purely military solutions. The character of the female scientist was thus an essential, unacknowledged agent of social change. The filmmakers, whether intentionally or not, were utilizing the freedom of the science fiction genre to depict a more egalitarian and meritocratic future. The vision was a direct challenge to the domestic conformity of the 1950s, asserting that the future of humanity's survival depended on mobilizing all of its intellectual resources, regardless of gender. The cinematic projection of women in lab coats and command centers was a quiet, profound prophecy that has been fully realized in the diverse, globally connected scientific workforce of today, confirming that the imaginative boundaries of sci-fi often exceed the social boundaries of its time. While the 1950s science fiction cinema proved to be remarkably prescient regarding automation, miniaturization, and surveillance, its visionary scope was not limitless. The decade's imagination was powerfully shaped by the specific anxieties and technological limitations of its time, leading to significant blind spots, areas of future reality that were either ignored, misunderstood, or simply deemed too impossible to visualize. Analyzing what the genre missed is as insightful as studying what it predicted, revealing the true boundaries of its Cold War-era imagination. The single most profound and consequential blind spot of 1950s sci-fi was the Internet and the World Wide Web. Despite accurately predicting video calls, advanced displays, and global communication, the concept of a decentralized, democratized, and publicly accessible global information network was almost entirely absent. The films often envision information access as a highly centralized resource controlled by governments, militaries, or large, monolithic corporations, echoing the command structures of the Cold War. The idea that every individual will become both a consumer and a creator of information, connecting peer-to-peer across the globe, was simply beyond the scope of their imagination. Their technological future was one of broadcast and hierarchy, not network and democracy. Another significant omission was the rise of social media and the attention economy. While Invasion of the Body Snatchers predicted the loss of self to conformity, the films failed to predict the mechanism, the voluntary surrender of privacy and individuality for the sake of constant digital validation. They did not foresee a world where humans would willingly submit their lives to pervasive surveillance and relentless self-documentation, a phenomenon driven by psychological, rather than purely political, needs. The 1950s sci-fi envisioned external control, not internal, self-imposed digital bondage. Furthermore, the genre largely missed the globalization of culture and politics outside of the immediate U.S.-Soviet rivalry. The films were intensely American-centric, with crises almost always resolving within U.S. borders or by American ingenuity. The future they predicted lacked the multipolar world, the rise of Asian economic power, and complex network political and economic interdependence that defines the 21st century. Their imagination was geographically limited by the geopolitical tensions of the time. The 1950s cinematic vision was bound by the physical constraints of the era. They understood rockets and metal, but not software and code. They understood political hierarchy, but not social networking. The blind spots, therefore, are a testament to the fact that technological evolution is often driven by unpredictable, nonlinear cultural and computational breakthroughs. The omission of the Internet, the most defining technology of our age, is a powerful reminder that while sci-fi can foresee the tools we will build, it can rarely foresee the social structures and human behaviors that those tools will ultimately create. The unpredicted future is often far stranger and far more connected than the atomic age could have ever conceived. The overarching, relentless theme of 1950s science fiction was not technological wonder, but existential dread. Films dealing explicitly with nuclear war, planetary invasion, or the breakdown of civilization such as On the Beach, 1959, or The Pervasive Threat in The Day the Earth Stood Still, were profound cinematic explorations of the concept that would later be codified as mutually assured destruction mad. These films acted as a collective conscience of the Cold War, accurately predicting the psychological terror and the necessary, grim logic that would underpin decades of global geopolitical strategy. The core narrative of many 1950s films was that conflict at the highest level leads to universal, indiscriminate annihilation. The Day the Earth Stood Still delivered this message most eloquently. The alien visitor Klaatu arrives not to conquer, but to warn humanity that his continued development of nuclear weapons poses a threat to the entire galaxy. His ultimate solution, a network of all-powerful robots, that instantly destroy any aggressor, is an early, fictionalized articulation of the MAD principle. The only way to ensure peace is through the absolute guarantee of instant, overwhelming retaliation against a first strike. The film suggested that the only true security comes from having a capability so terrifying that no one dares to use it. This terrifying logic became the actual foundation of U.S.-Soviet nuclear policy. Furthermore, the sci-fi of the time captured the irreversible nature of global catastrophe. On the Beach, though released at the very end of the decade, depicted a world slowly dying from nuclear fallout after a brief, distant war. The film showed no hero, no last-minute rescue, and no technological fix. Only the slow, quiet surrender to the inevitable. This profound pessimism accurately reflected the bleak realization among military strategists that a full-scale nuclear exchange was a zero-sum game with no survivors, directly mirroring the grim calculation of MAD. The films, in essence, were psychological training grounds for this reality, allowing the public to process the unthinkable consequence of their nation's policies. The constant cinematic exposure to global annihilation normalized the idea that humanity was living under a sword of Damocles, fostering a necessary fatalism that both terrified and stabilized the Cold War world. The prediction was not technological. It was strategic and psychological. The 1950s cinema recognized that once the power of the atomic bomb was unleashed, the only remaining strategy would be a paradox. Total war must be made unthinkable by making its cost absolute and guaranteed. The pessimistic, apocalyptic narratives were, therefore, a crucial cultural artifact that both documented and propelled the Cold War's defining geopolitical concept. The cinematic portrayal of global doom was a profound, often overlooked, prophecy that shaped the world's strategic reality for nearly half a century. The ray gun is perhaps the most iconic and whimsical symbol of 1950s science fiction, a quintessential piece of imaginative gear that fueled countless childhood fantasies. While the on-screen weapon often discharged colorful, unrealistic beams of energy, the cinematic obsession with non-projectile, directed energy weapons was, in fact, a technological forecast that set the stage for the real-world development of laser technology, microwave weapons, and directed energy systems that are now standard in military and commercial applications. The fantasy of the ray gun was driven by the Cold War's desire for the ultimate clean, fast, and decisive weapon. Films of the era correctly identified the principle, the ability to project concentrated energy across distance to destroy or incapacitate a target, even if the execution was fictional. The cinematic push for focused energy coincided with the scientific research into masers and, eventually, lasers. The science fiction narrative created the cultural aspiration for a directed energy device that could operate at the speed of light, influencing the prioritization of research into coherent light amplification. The films understood that the future of warfare would be about speed and precision, moving beyond the slow, imprecise mechanics of bullet and shell. The evolution from the fictional ray gun to the modern laser is a direct line from fantasy to functionality. Lasers, now used in everything from medical surgery and data transmission to military targeting and defense, are the full realization of the ray gun's core principle. The early cinematic weapons may have looked like chrome toys, but they predicted the military's current focus on developing high-energy laser weapons capable of shooting down drones, missiles, and even engaging in blinding or disabling enemy sensors. The ray gun was simply the 1950s visual shorthand for a weapon powered by light. Furthermore, the sci-fi often explore the non-lethal application of energy weapons, devices used to stun, disable, or melt without immediate, bloody consequence. This foreshadowed the real-world development of non-lethal directed energy weapons, such as active denial systems that use microwaves for crowd control, which are designed to incapacitate without permanent injury. The filmmakers recognized that the true power of energy projection lay in its versatility, the ability to precisely control the level of force applied. The enduring presence of the ray gun in 1950s cinema was a clear cultural signal that the era of chemical and kinetic warfare was giving way to the age of pure energy. The films provided a thrilling, if simplified, visual vocabulary for a complex technological transition. The whimsical ray gun of the 1950s is no longer a fantasy. It is an integrated, indispensable component of modern scientific, military, and consumer technology, proving that even the most playful cinematic devices can carry the weight of serious technological prophecy. We began this journey by looking back at the silver screens of the 1950s, a decade consumed by the paradox of limitless possibility and imminent destruction. What we have uncovered is that the science fiction cinema of that era was not just a collection of escapist B movies, but profound collective cultural vision that has proven to be an astonishingly accurate mirror to the 21st century. The filmmakers, artists, and writers, constrained by the technological limits of vacuum tubes and the geopolitical pressures of the Cold War, nevertheless managed to chart the psychological, social, and technological course of our modern world. They predicted the ubiquity of miniaturization and the smartphone, the rise of the personal robot and advanced AI, the terrifying reality of the surveillance state, the ethical minefield of genetic engineering, and the grim geopolitical logic of mutually assured destruction. Crucially, their greatest prophecy was not technological, but philosophical. They consistently warned that humanity's greatest challenge would not be building the advanced technology, but controlling the ethical consequences of that technology. They foresaw that the fear of losing our humanity to the pod people of conformity, or the struggle to find purpose in the automated economy, will become the defining anxieties of our age. The 1950s science fiction cinema provided us with the ethical vocabulary to discuss the very technologies we have now created. When we debate the ethics of AI, we are debating the monster from the ID. When we worry about conformity, we are recalling the body snatchers. And when we discuss global climate threats, we are looking at the same scale of destruction they projected in their weather warfare films. The vintage visions still matter because they continue to serve as our moral compass. They remind us that the anxieties of the past are the realities of the present, and that our current technological progress must be guided not by limitless ambition, but by profound wisdom, the very wisdom the heroes of these old films were always desperately searching for. The future they saw is here. It is up to us to ensure we navigate it with the humanity that those classic films championed.